The morning Esther Quinn was supposed to become the happiest woman in Caldwell, Kansas. She stood at the altar of the First Methodist Church in a dress her mother had spent 4 months stitching by hand, and watched the door at the back of the church stay closed for so long that the silence became its own living, breathing creature. It was the spring of 1878, and Caldwell sat at the edge of everything, the last proper town before the cattle trails pushed south into Indian Territory, a place where fortunes were made and lost between sunrise and the next rainfall, where men came with dreams sewn into their boot linings, and women learned to anchor themselves to the earth or be swept away entirely. The whole territory had turned out that Saturday. There were ranchers and their wives, trail hands in their Sunday shirts, the mayor and his enormous wife who fanned herself with a paper fan painted with pink roses, the schoolteacher Miss Hartley who cried at every wedding whether she knew the parties or not, and somewhere near the back, leaning against the rough-hewn wall with his hat in his hands, a man named Ira Malone, who had only come because his friend Dewey had dragged him from the livery stable and said a man needed to see something beautiful every now and again. Esther stood at the altar with a bouquet of wild columbines and prairie roses she had gathered herself that morning, because she had wanted something of the land in her hands on the day she changed her life. She was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned beneath her veil, and eyes the color of creek water where it runs deep and clear over smooth stones. She had a way of holding her chin that suggested she had decided something and meant it, a quality that the women of Caldwell admired, and the men of Caldwell sometimes found unsettling, which was perhaps why it had taken her until 24 to find someone willing to stand at the front of this church and receive her. His name was Gerald Pruitt, and he owned the biggest mercantile in town and a cattle operation of some 300 head, and he was handsome enough in the manner of a man who has always been told he is handsome, and believes it entirely. He had courted Esther for 8 months in the way that men court women when they have decided they would like to own something, and have not yet realized that women are not a species of property. He had brought her candy sticks and bolts of calico, and once a music box from a catalog all the way from St. Louis, and Esther had accepted these things with graciousness because her father, Thomas Quinn, was a good man with a bad back and a small farm that was losing the argument against drought, and Gerald Pruitt had made it quietly but perfectly clear that he intended to be generous to the Quinn family once the papers were signed. So Esther had said yes, and her mother had wept with joy and begun cutting the pattern for the dress that same night, and Esther had pressed her face into her pillow in the dark and told herself that fondness was a reasonable foundation for a life, that plenty of women built perfectly good existences on exactly that warmth and security, and a man who treated her with basic respect were not nothing. They were, in fact, more than many women ever got. She had been almost convinced. The clock on the wall of the church read 10 minutes past the hour when the door opened. Esther's heart rose like a bird startled from a fence, and then settled again when she saw it was not Gerald but his foreman, a thick-necked man named Cobb Briggs, who walked down the aisle with the expression of a man walking toward something he would very much rather be walking away from. He reached the altar and he leaned in, and he spoke quietly but not quietly enough, because First Methodist was not a large church, and the whole of Caldwell heard him say, clear as a Sunday bell, that Gerald Pruitt had ridden out before dawn and was already 40 miles south, and was not, under any circumstances, coming back. He had left a note, which Cobb Briggs placed in Esther's white-gloved hand with the air of a man discharging himself of an obligation he did not personally endorse. The note said, in Gerald's rather fine handwriting, that he had come to understand that marriage was a different proposition than he had anticipated, and that he wished Esther every happiness, and that he had instructed his brother to honor the quarterly payments to her father's farm for the next year as a demonstration of his goodwill, which was perhaps the most insulting thing anyone had ever done to Esther Quinn in her entire life. She stood there, and she did not cry. She was aware of that later, the way she was aware of it at the time, that something in her had refused the easy release of tears, had clenched around itself like a fist and gone completely, strangely still. She heard the sound the crowd made, that ripple of breath and whisper that moved through the pews like wind moving through tall grass. She heard Miss Hartley begin to cry, which under the circumstances felt almost satirical. She heard the mayor's wife's fan stop moving. She heard Reverend Gates, who was a kind man, begin to say something in a soothing voice that she already knew she would not be able to hear past the blood rushing in her ears. She looked down at the bouquet of columbines and prairie roses in her hands, and she thought about how she had gotten up before sunrise to gather them, had walked out into the cool blue morning and bent over the creek bed where the wildflowers came in best that time of year, and she had thought, while she picked them, that this was going to be the last morning of her old life and the first morning of her new one. She had let herself feel hopeful, standing there in the wet grass in her everyday dress. She had let herself imagine something good, and then, from somewhere near the back of the church, in the absolute silence that followed all of that, a man's voice spoke. It was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the kind of voice that had a weight to it, a density that made it carry through a room the way a stone sinks through water, not with violence, but with a certainty that nothing is going to stop it. The voice said, "That is not how this ends." Esther turned. She did not know the man. He was standing near the back wall with his hat held against his chest with both hands, and he was looking at her, not at the crowd, not at the altar, not at the reverend, at her directly, with the kind of steadiness that she had not encountered very many times in her life and which she felt, even at that distance and through the gauze of her veil, with a startling physical clarity. He was perhaps 30 years old, lean in the way that men get lean from work rather than want, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that suggested stubbornness, and a pair of eyes that she was too far away to read the color of but which she somehow already suspected were going to be a problem for her. "What did you say?" Reverend Gates said. "I said that is not how this ends," the man repeated, and he was already moving up the aisle, unhurried but deliberate, people in the pews turning to watch him pass with expressions that ranged from astonishment to outrage to, in the case of several women between the ages of 30 and 60, something that was openly approving. He reached the front of the church and he stopped and he looked at Esther and she looked at him, and the whole territory of Caldwell held its breath. "I don't know you," Esther said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Later she would be proud of that. "No," he said. "My name is Ira Malone. I work the Callaway spread 2 miles east of town. I've seen you at the market on Thursdays." He paused. "Your father's farm is over on the creek bend." "It is," she said. "Then you know good land when you see it," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, something careful and considered, that made it clear he was not talking about her father's farm anymore. "I don't think you should be standing up here alone. I think you should have someone standing up here with you who actually wants to be here. And if you'll permit me to say so, I think this whole arrangement you've been talked into has been about everyone's comfort except yours." The mayor made a sound that was somewhere between a cough and a protest. "I don't require someone to rescue me," Esther said. "No," Ira agreed immediately without any hesitation at all, which surprised her. "You don't. But I figured you might want company while you decide what comes next. That's different." Esther looked at him for a long moment. Behind her, Reverend Gates was gripping his Bible with both hands and looking at the ceiling as if asking the Lord for specific guidance on how to handle this particular development, which was not covered in any of his theological training. The mayor's wife had started her fan going again. Someone in the back pew sneezed. The whole of Caldwell, Kansas waited. Esther took off her veil. She pulled the pins out with her free hand, one by one, and she handed the veil to Reverend Gates, who took it without comment. And then she stepped down from the altar platform, and she walked up the aisle of First Methodist Church with her bouquet of columbines and prairie roses in her hands and her head up. And when she reached the doors, she pushed them open herself and walked out into the May sunshine. And behind her, she heard the man Ira Malone's boots on the wooden floor following at a respectful distance. Not crowding her, not rushing her, just there. The light outside was extraordinary. She had forgotten, in the dim wood-end candle interior of the church, how blue the sky could be. She stood on the church steps and breathed, and behind her she heard the doors open again, and she felt him stop beside her, not touching, just standing close enough that she could have reached out and touched his arm if she had wanted to. "What made you say that?" she asked, without turning to look at him. "Honest answer. I wouldn't ask for any other kind." He was quiet for a moment, and she appreciated that he did not reach for the first comfortable thing. "I've seen a lot of people swallow things that didn't fit them," he said finally. "Swallow whole lives that were shaped by other people's needs. My mother did it. It does something to a person, bends them in ways that don't ever quite straighten." Another pause. "You didn't look like a woman who was excited about the life she was walking into. You looked like a woman who had decided to be brave about it, and those are two different things." Esther turned and looked at him then. Up close his eyes were the color of dark tobacco, warm and complicated, and there were lines at the corners from squinting into prairie sun, and he was watching her with an expression that was not pity. She would not have tolerated pity, would have ended this conversation immediately for pity, but something closer to honest curiosity, as though she were something he had not encountered before and was genuinely interested in understanding. "You don't know me," she said again. "No," he said. "But I'd like to." She thought about her father's farm. She thought about the 4 months her mother had spent on the dress she was still wearing. She thought about the note in Gerald Pruitt's fine handwriting, sitting somewhere in the wreckage of that church, and the humiliation of standing at an altar in front of the whole territory while the man who was supposed to want her chose 40 miles of open trail instead. She thought about the columbines in her hands, which were still holding their shape, still bright and impossible and alive. "You can start," she said, "by walking me home. My boots are pinching something terrible, and I would like to take this dress off before I do something violent to it." Something shifted in his expression, and she thought it might be the beginning of a smile, though it had not quite committed itself to becoming one yet. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and he offered his arm with the kind of straightforward, uncomplicated courtesy that suggested it was simply what a person did when a woman's boots were pinching. And Esther Quinn took it, and they walked down the church steps together while inside the building the whole territory of Caldwell resumed breathing. The walk to the Quinn farm was 2 miles along a road that turned to packed dirt between the last of the town's buildings and the creek bend, where Thomas Quinn's land started. The day was warming fast, the way May days did on the Kansas plains, where the morning could be cool enough for a shawl, and the afternoon could be hot enough to make the light bend at the horizon. Esther had pulled the wedding dress's train up and pinned it with a hairpin she found in her sleeve pocket, which created an arrangement that was practical if not elegant. And Ira Malone walked beside her at an easy pace, without once suggesting that she might want to slow down or speed up or conduct herself differently in any way. "You said you worked the Callaway spread," she said, when they had been walking long enough for the church to be out of sight and the road to have gentled into something more familiar to her feet. "Going on 3 years," he said. "Started as a trail hand, moved up to wrangler. Mr. Callaway's got good cattle and he's a fair man." He paused. "I came out from Missouri. Had a piece of land I was trying to hold on to out there, but the bank and the drought put an end to that argument around 74. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "It was a clarifying experience," he said, with a dryness that made her want to laugh and surprised her. "Taught me what I needed and what I only thought I needed. Those are often different lists. What did you need?" He considered this as though it were a serious question, which she had intended it to be. "Work that means something, land I can trust, enough quiet to think in." He glanced sideways at her. "Company that doesn't require me to be someone I'm not." Esther looked at the road ahead. The creek was coming into view at the far bend, a silver thread in the green of the spring grass. Gerald used to tell me what topics were appropriate for a woman to have opinions on, she said, and she was surprised at herself for saying it, for offering it up just like that to this stranger. But somehow the surprise was mild. Somehow it felt like the right thing to say. Ira said nothing for a moment. Then quietly, what topics did he approve of? Household management, the price of calico, the weather as it affected the garden, whether the reverend's sermons were running too long. She paused. He was not interested in my thoughts on the drought or on what the new territorial governor might mean for land rights or on whether the cattle market was going to turn by August. What do you think? Ira asked. About the cattle market by August. She looked at him sharply. He was watching the road ahead, his expression entirely serious. I think the drives coming up from Texas are going to flood the market again, and the price per head is going to be down 15 to 20% from last year, she said carefully, watching for the expression that men got when women spoke precisely about things they were not supposed to know about. It did not appear. He nodded slowly instead. I've been thinking the same. Callaway wants to hold his herd back till September and see if the price settles. That's smart, she said. I'll tell him you said so, he said. And this time the smile did commit itself, quietly, at the corner of his mouth, and it changed his face in a way that she was going to need some time to not think about. They reached the Quinn farm by mid-morning, and the sight of her mother coming around the side of the house, already forewarned by whatever swift system of communication small towns deployed in times of emergency, stopped them both at the gate. Margaret Quinn was a compact woman of 50 with flour perpetually somewhere on her person, and the expression of someone who had decided to love her life even when her life was difficult. And she looked at her daughter in the altered wedding dress, and at the strange man beside her with the hat in his hands, and she pressed her lips together and she said, "I'll put the coffee on." Thomas Quinn was sitting on the porch with his bad back held straight by careful effort, and his expression composed into something that did not quite succeed at being neutral. He was a tall, weathered man who had worked this land for 20 years, and he looked at Ira Malone with the measuring look that fathers develop, a kind of inventory, quick and thorough. "Ira Malone," Ira said before Thomas could ask. "I work for Callaway. I walked your daughter home." "I can see that," Thomas said. He looked at Esther. "Are you all right, Essie?" "I am perfectly fine," Esther said, and the remarkable thing was that she was beginning to mean it. She went inside and changed into her everyday dress, a practical thing in brown calico, and when she came back out her mother had set coffee and bread on the table on the porch, and Ira Malone was sitting across from her father with his hat on his knee, and they were, of all things, talking about the creek's tendency to flood in late spring, and what could be done about the lower field's drainage situation. Esther stood in the doorway for a moment, watching, and felt something shift inside her chest, not the dramatic shift of a heart turning over like a stone in a current, but something quieter, something settling. She sat down and poured herself coffee and joined the conversation, and the four of them sat on the porch of the Quinn farm, while the May morning opened into afternoon, and the talk moved from drainage to seed prices to the new territorial legislation about grazing rights to a hawk that was circling over the east field with designs on something in the grass. And Esther talked and was listened to and talked some more, and Ira Malone's dark eyes came back to her regularly. Not in the way men's eyes came back to something they wanted to own, but in the way eyes come back to something that interests them, something they are still working out. And she found that she did not mind the examination at all. He left in the early afternoon with a handshake for Thomas and a courteous nod for Margaret, and he said to Esther at the gate simply, "Would it be all right if I called on Thursday? I'm in town for the market anyway." "Thursday is fine," she said. He nodded, settled his hat on his head, and walked back down the road toward town with the unhurried gait of a man who has decided where he is going and is not in any particular need of rushing there, and Esther watched him go and heard her mother appear at her shoulder. "Well," Margaret Quinn said. "Don't," Esther said. "I haven't said anything." "You are about to." A pause. "He has a nice way about him," Margaret said. "He does," Esther agreed, and went inside before her mother could see her expression. Thursday came, and with it Ira Malone, arriving at the market in town with the other Callaway hands and managing, without any apparent effort, to conclude his business in the general vicinity of the stall where Esther sold her mother's preserved goods and her own embroidery work. He did not hover or crowd her. He bought a jar of her mother's blackberry preserve and paid the full asking price without haggling, which Esther noted, and then he found a reason to be nearby while she packed up her stall in the afternoon, and he walked with her to the edge of town, and then along the road toward the farm, talking about nothing of great consequence and everything of great interest, the kind of conversation that covers ordinary ground and somehow keeps arriving at something real. He came back the following Thursday, and the one after that. By June he had taken to coming on Sundays as well, arriving at the Quinn farm after the service at First Methodist, which Esther attended with her chin up, and the good breeding to let no one see that walking into that building still required her to shore herself up against the memory of standing at the front of it, in a white dress with nowhere to put her hands, and spending the afternoon helping Thomas with whatever repair the farm had most recently devised to require attention, and staying for supper, and sitting with Esther on the porch afterward in the long summer evenings, when the light went gold and then rose, and then the first stars showed up over the eastern horizon. He was a good man with a practical turn of mind and an unexpected depth to him that kept surprising her. He had read more than she expected, not just almanacs and land papers, but actual books, borrowed from wherever he could find them, and he had opinions about what he read that were worth having. He was funny in the way that quiet men are sometimes funny, not performing it but allowing it to appear when it wanted to. And when he was around her father, he showed a natural respect that was not servile but genuine, one working man to another, and Thomas Quinn, who was not a man given to quick judgments or quick warmth, had thawed to something unmistakably like approval by the end of June. With Esther herself, he was careful. That was the word she kept returning to. Not careful in the way of a man who was afraid of her, or careful in the way of a man who was performing caution while planning something else, but careful in the way of someone who understood that she had been handled badly, and who did not want to be another person who moved through her life without respect for the terrain. He did not crowd her or rush her or suggest with his manner that he was waiting for her to catch up to a conclusion he had already reached. He was simply there, consistent and present and honest, and he listened when she spoke, genuinely listened, in the way that people who have grown up around other people who did not listen at all sometimes become listeners of unusual quality. There was an evening in early July when they were sitting on the porch after supper and Thomas and Margaret had gone inside, and the evening star had appeared over the cottonwoods along the creek, and Esther had been quiet for long enough that Ira looked at her sideways and said, "Where did you go?" "I was thinking about how strange it is," she said, "that the worst thing that happened to me this year might also turn out to be the luckiest." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad you can see it that way. It took courage to walk out of that church." "You said it didn't end there," she reminded him. "You were the one who took the veil off," he said. "I said 5 words. You're the one who chose what they meant." She turned and looked at him, really looked at him, in the soft evening light, and she thought about what she had been willing to settle for and what she might have missed, and she thought about how he had stood up in that church not to rescue her, but to refuse the idea that this was all there was for her, and she thought that was perhaps the most respectful thing anyone had ever done on her behalf. "Ira," she said. "Yes. I think I'm in considerable danger of being quite glad you were at that church." He looked at her, and the expression on his face was not triumphant or smug or even particularly surprised, but there was something in it that was very warm, and it moved through her like the first warmth of the sun after a cold morning. "I think," he said carefully, "that I have been more careful about not presuming things than I have ever been about anything in my life. And I'd like to be honest with you about the fact that being careful is getting somewhat harder." "Is that right?" she said. "That is right," he confirmed. The locusts were singing in the cottonwoods, and the evening star was getting company as the sky darkened, and Esther Quinn took a long, quiet breath and made a decision the way she had learned to make decisions, not in a rush, not out of need, but from a still and certain place inside her that knew what it wanted. "You could be less careful," she said, "if you wanted to." He looked at her for another moment, and then he reached over slowly and took her hand where it was resting on the arm of the porch chair, and he held it, and that was all, but the warmth of his hand around hers was a complete and entire thing, and she did not pull away. "I've been wanting to do that," he said quietly, "since about the third Thursday." "Only the third," she said. "I'm a slow and deliberate man," he said very dryly, and she laughed, and the sound of her laughing in the warm July dark startled a bird up from the cottonwoods and sent it rattling off into the evening, and Ira Malone sat beside her holding her hand with an expression of simple, undramatic happiness that she thought was perhaps the most attractive thing she had ever seen on a human face. July moved into August, and the cattle market came in exactly as Esther had predicted, down 17%. Which Calloway weathered because he had taken the advice to wait and got a better price in September, and which he acknowledged by giving Ira Malone a bonus that amounted to the equivalent of 2 months' wages. And Ira did not spend it on anything immediately but put it carefully away. And Esther knew this because he told her quietly over supper at the Quinn farm. And she appreciated both the information and the manner of its delivery, which was plain-spoken and included the phrase, "I'm trying to build something worth offering." There were things he had to navigate that were harder than cattle prices. The town had opinions about Esther Quinn, the way towns always have opinions about women whose lives have not gone in the expected directions. There was a segment of Caldwell that had decided that being left at the altar was the kind of misfortune that attached to a woman and followed her, that it indicated some deficiency in her too proud, too particular, too much given to opinions on the cattle market, and that therefore any man who took an interest in her was either charitable or unwise. There were conversations at the general store and at the water pump and in the Methodist Ladies' Society that Esther was aware of without always hearing them directly, and they did not break her. She was not built to be broken by the arithmetic of other people's small-mindedness. But they required maintenance, that particular effort of carrying yourself with dignity when dignity is inconvenient. What helped was that Ira was entirely unbothered by the town's opinions in a way that was not defiant. He did not make a show of not caring, which would have been its own kind of performance, but simply genuine. He had no investment in what people thought of him, or rather, he had only an investment in what people whose judgment he respected thought of him, and the list of people whose judgment he respected was not long but was careful, and it included Thomas Quinn and Margaret Quinn and the Reverend and Dewey, his friend from the livery stable, who had turned out to be a wiry, good-natured man with a gap between his front teeth and an encyclopedic knowledge of horses, and who had looked at Esther the first time Ira brought her around the stables and said, "Well, I can see why he walked up that aisle," which had been embarrassing and also, Esther had to admit, rather touching. It was in the middle of August that Gerald Prout made the mistake of coming back to Caldwell. He had apparently been in Wichita, doing whatever men who flee their own weddings do in Wichita, and some business obligation had brought him back, and he had decided, with the characteristic overconfidence of a man who had never been held accountable for much, that he could return without difficulty. He arrived on a Tuesday and was at the general store by Wednesday morning, and by Wednesday afternoon word had traveled the full circuit of Caldwell's geography and reached Esther at the market stall where she was tallying the week's receipts. She heard it and she set down her pencil, and she was very still for a moment, the way she had been still in the church, and then she picked up her pencil again and went back to the tallying, because she had numbers to finish, and Gerald Prout's existence was not a reason to stop. Ira heard it at the livery stable an hour later, from Dewey, who conveyed the information with the tone of a man relaying intelligence about a coming weather system. Ira thanked him and went back to the work he was doing, which was mending a broken bridle with the careful hands of someone who had learned that most things could be fixed if you were patient about it. He saw Gerald Prout on the street that afternoon. Gerald was coming out of the bank, looking prosperous and entirely unbothered, and he saw Ira and the recognition was mutual, though they had never spoken. Gerald Prout had the kind of face that reveals calculation even when it is trying to appear casual, and Ira Malone read that calculation in about 3 seconds and disliked what it said. Gerald nodded. Ira nodded back. That was the entirety of their exchange, but something was communicated nonetheless, and Ira thought about Esther at the market stall with her pencil and her receipts, and the chin she had learned to hold up, and he felt something settle in him that was not anger precisely, but was the very close neighbor of anger, quiet and resolved and ready to be something else if it was called upon. He went to the Quinn farm that evening without it being a Sunday or a Thursday, which was unusual enough that Margaret Quinn raised her eyebrows at him from the kitchen window when he came up the path, and he asked if Esther was home, and Margaret said she was on the porch, and he went around and found her sitting with her embroidery in the gold light, very composed and very occupied, with the particular quality of composure that he had come to recognize as the outer surface of something she was working through on the inside. "I heard," he said, when he reached the porch. "Everyone heard," she said, without looking up from her embroidery. He sat down in the chair beside her and was quiet for a moment. "How are you?" "Perfectly fine," she said, and then after a pause with somewhat less conviction, "Mostly fine." Another pause. "I find I'm angry, which I didn't expect. I thought I was past it. I thought I had decided it was a fortunate thing that he went and didn't come back, and I had. I do think that. But seeing his name on something makes it all feel recent again, and I am angry that he gets to walk down that street as though he did not do to me what he did." "That's a reasonable thing to be angry about," Ira said. "I know," she said, and finally looked up from her embroidery and looked at him directly. "And I'm telling you because you're the person I tell things to." He held her gaze and felt, in the specific weight and warmth of what she had just said, something that was unmistakably important. "Good," he said. "That's exactly where I want to be." She nodded and went back to her embroidery for a moment, and then she set it down on her knee and said, "Did you see him, briefly, on the street? Did you say anything?" "No." "Good," she said, and there was something firm in it, something that he understood immediately. She did not want it handled. She did not want him to go do something dramatic on her behalf that she would then have to feel obligated about. She wanted what he was already doing, which was sitting beside her in the evening light and being someone she could tell things to. "What I will tell you," Ira said carefully, "is that he does not appear to be troubled by what he did, which suggests he never fully understood what he was capable of doing. And men who don't understand what they're capable of doing tend to keep doing it. But that's his problem and his consequence to arrive at, not yours." Esther looked at him. "You've thought about this?" "I think about things that matter to me," he said. She held that for a moment. "Ira," she said. "Esther." "I believe I am in love with you," she said, very quietly and very directly, with the particular courage of a woman who has learned that waiting for safety is sometimes another word for waiting forever. "I think it's been building since the 3rd Thursday, if I'm being specific about it. But I'm telling you now because Gerald Prout being in this town and breathing this air has reminded me that life is irritatingly short, and I see no reason to continue being careful with something I am quite sure of." He looked at her for one long, steady moment, and then he reached over and took the embroidery off her lap and set it aside very carefully so the needle didn't catch, and he took both her hands in his and he said, "I have been in love with you since you took your veil off in that church. I was afraid to say it because I didn't want to be another man who moved too fast for his own reasons and not yours. You moved at exactly the right pace," she said, "but I think we've arrived." "We have," he said. He kissed her for the first time there on the porch, while the cottonwoods made their evening sound, and the light went amber and her mother. visible through the window, if either of them had been looking in that direction, turned around and went back to her kitchen with an expression that could only be described as deeply satisfied. Gerald Prout left Caldwell 3 days later, apparently having concluded his business affairs more quickly than anticipated, or possibly having absorbed sufficient information about the current state of affairs in his absence to conclude that Caldwell was a less comfortable town for him than it had been. He did not speak to Esther, and Esther did not seek him out, and when he was gone, she found that the anger went with him mostly, leaving behind something cleaner, not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but the beginning of the space that forgiveness eventually moves into. September came with its particular Kansas quality, the air clearing after the heat, the grass going gold, the sky getting that hard, polished blue that had no equivalent in any other season. The Callaway cattle drove to market and returned Ira's faith in the timing of things. Esther's mother's preserves sold out entirely at the fall market, and Margaret Quinn celebrated by making a lemon cake of extraordinary quality, which they ate on the porch on a Sunday afternoon, with the satisfaction of people who had had a good season. It was on that Sunday that Ira Malone sat forward in his chair after the lemon cake was finished and looked at Thomas Quinn with a very direct expression and said, without any elaborate preamble, "I would like to ask your daughter to marry me, Mr. Quinn, and I am asking you first because I think it is the right way to do it. Though I'll be plain with you, if she says yes and you say no, I will respect your position, but I'll be talking to her about it, because she is a grown woman and it's her life to decide about. And I think you'd want me to say that to you honestly rather than pretend I'd leave it entirely in your hands." Thomas Quinn looked at him for a long moment, and then he looked at Esther, who had gone quite still with her cake fork in her hand, and then he looked at Ira again and he said, "That is the most direct and also most correct thing I have heard anyone say in a very long time." "Is that a yes?" Ira asked. "It is very much a yes," Thomas said. Ira turned to Esther. She had set her fork down. Her expression was, he thought he would spend the rest of his life trying to find the right word for her expression in that moment, and never quite land on it. It was not surprise, exactly. It was something more like recognition, the expression of someone who has arrived at the place they had been moving toward and finds it is real, finds it is exactly what they imagined it might be. "Esther," he said, "you are the most remarkable woman I have ever encountered in my life. I would like to spend the rest of mine in your company, helping with whatever you're building, learning from you when you'll let me, and being the kind of man who deserves to have you trust him with the things you tell only to people who matter to you." He paused. "I don't have a ring yet. I wanted to ask first and choose it with you, because you ought to have the thing you want, not the thing I guessed at." She looked at him for a moment, and he could see the brightness at the corners of her eyes, and he knew she would not cry. He had never once seen her cry, but the brightness was there. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." Ira Malone, was there any other answer available? "There were several," he said, "and I respected all of them." "Yes," she said again, more warmly, "you always do. Come here." He moved to her chair and she stood up, and he held both her hands, and Margaret Quinn made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. And Thomas Quinn stood up from his chair with his bad back and shook Ira's hand with both of his and said, "Welcome to this family, son." And Ira felt something that he had not felt in a very long time, something he had not let himself expect, the specific warmth of belonging somewhere that was chosen rather than merely assigned. They chose the ring together the following week, a simple gold band with a small garnet set into it, from the jeweler who came through Caldwell on his quarterly circuit and set up in the back room of the general store. Esther held it up in the afternoon light coming through the store window and turned it and said it was exactly right, and Ira put it on her finger there in the back room of the general store, with the jeweler discreetly examining something at the far end of the room. And Esther looked at it on her hand and looked up at him, and he kissed her forehead, and she pressed her face briefly against his shoulder, and then they both straightened up because there was still a formal occasion to plan and the practical business of a life to get on with. They set the date for the second Saturday of November, which gave them 2 months, which was, they agreed, enough time to do the thing right without turning it into an industry. Esther was clear that she wanted something honest and warm and unperformative, and what she meant by this, which she did not say aloud to the Methodist Ladies' Society, but said directly to Ira and her mother, was that she had already stood at one altar for the benefit of an audience, and she was not interested in repeating the experience. What she wanted was a marriage, not a wedding, and the wedding was simply the door you went through to get there. What they planned was a ceremony at the Quinn farm, outside by the creek bend, where the cottonwoods were still holding some of their fall color, officiated by Reverend Gates, who was quietly pleased and showed it by arriving early and bringing chrysanthemums from his wife's garden. The guest list was modest and deliberate. Thomas and Margaret, the Calloway family, Dewey from the livery stable, Miss Hartley the schoolteacher who wept at appropriate occasions and a few inappropriate ones, and perhaps a dozen other people from town who had shown themselves, over the course of the preceding months, to be the kind of people Esther and Ira actually wanted in their lives, rather than simply people who lived in proximity to them. The morning of the second Saturday in November was cold and clear, with a frost on the grass that the sun was burning off by 9 o'clock, and the cottonwoods were bare now, but the shape of them against the sky was beautiful in the austere way of November trees, and Margaret Quinn had threaded ribbons of gold and russet through the fence rails along the path to the creek, and it looked, Esther thought, exactly like something she would have chosen. She wore her mother's dress. Not the wedding dress from May, which had been folded and put away for purposes yet undetermined. She was not quite ready to make it into something else and could not bring herself to look at it directly, so it sat in the cedar chest, and they both allowed it to sit there unaddressed, which was fine. She wore her mother's Sunday dress, deep blue wool, which Margaret had altered to fit Esther's broader shoulders, and which had about it a quality of genuine beauty, the beauty of something worn by someone who loved it and then passed on. She wore the wild columbines again. She had pressed several from her May bouquet between the pages of her mother's Bible, and she wore them now alongside 2 November chrysanthemums from the Reverend's wife's garden, and she carried them in both hands, and this time she walked through the gate of the Quinn farm, and along the path to the creek bend, where Ira was standing with Reverend Gates and Dewey and the whole small gathered company of their friends, and the frost was gone from the grass, and the sun was full on the cottonwoods. And Ira Malone was watching her come toward him with an expression that she thought she was going to remember for the rest of her life, the absolute unguarded openness of it, the way he was not managing his face into anything at all but simply looking at her as she came to him. She stopped in front of him and looked up at him, and he said very quietly just to her, before Reverend Gates had said a word, "You are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." "You're going to make me cry," she warned him. "No, I'm not," he said with certainty. "You never cry." "I might start," she said. He took her hands and held them and looked at her, and she looked at him, and something was complete in that looking, something that did not require any words to be real, but that the words would make formal and permanent and right. Reverend Gates conducted the ceremony with a simple warmth and an admirable brevity. The vows they exchanged were the traditional ones, and they said them clearly and to each other's faces. And when it was done and Reverend Gates said what reverends say at the conclusion of these things, Ira cupped her face in both his work-roughened hands and kissed her, and Dewey made a sound of enthusiastic approval, and Miss Hartley cried, and the cottonwoods above the creek bend made a sound like applause in the November wind. Margaret Quinn had prepared a wedding supper of stunning ambition for a woman working with one wood stove, and 2 daughters borrowed from neighboring farms for the occasion, and they ate and drank cold cider, and Thomas Quinn made a toast that was short and precise, and included the line, "I am more glad for the way this year went than I know how to say." which made Margaret press her fingers to her mouth and made Esther reach across the table and squeeze her father's hand. Dewey told a story about the first time he had seen Ira in Caldwell, which involved a mule, a broken wheel, and a series of decisions that Ira maintained to this day had been entirely rational, which made everyone laugh. And Calloway stood up and said a few words about Ira's character that were honest and straightforward and generous in the way of a man who means what he says. And his wife pressed her handkerchief to her nose and said she had never attended a lovelier wedding in her life. They stayed late, all of them reluctant to release the evening, and when the last guest had gone and Thomas and Margaret had retreated to the house, Esther and Ira stood by the creek in the dark, her hand in his, looking at the stars that had come out in their November fullness over the Kansas plains. "Hello, Mrs. Malone," he said. "Hello, Mr. Malone," she said. "What do we do now?" "We go home," he said. "We don't have a home yet," she pointed out. They had discussed this in practical terms over the preceding weeks. His arrangement with Calloway, her parents' farm, the question of where they would establish themselves, which required some resolution they had not quite reached. "We have a place we're going tonight," he said, "and we have everything we need to build the rest. That's enough to start with." She turned and looked at him in the dark. "You really are an unusually settled man, do you know that?" "You are the least settled thing in my life," he said, with great affection, "and I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give." They had arranged to use the Calloway guest room for the winter, while Ira finalized the purchase of a small piece of land 3 miles east of the Quinn farm land that came available in October when the previous owner, an older man named Hartwell, decided he was done with Kansas and moved to live with his daughter in St. Louis. It was 30 acres of good land with a creek running through the east corner and a house that needed work but had sound bones, and they were buying it with Ira's savings and the bonus from September, and a loan from Calloway that Ira intended to pay back in 3 years and did in 2.5. The winter was not easy in the way that winters on the Kansas plains were not easy, which was to say it was cold and long and dark, and the work was constant and unglamorous. Esther learned the specific language of Ira's silences, which were contented and which were tired, and which meant he was working through something and would come out the other side of it in his own time. And Ira learned the specific geography of Esther's opinions, which were numerous and well considered, and delivered with a directness that he loved the way some men love difficult landscape, for what it required of you and what it revealed. They repaired the Hartwell house together through that winter, by degrees, in the hours between the day's work and the darkness. Ira was good with wood and stone and practical construction, and Esther had a quality of spatial understanding that meant she could look at a room and see what it should be, and could communicate that vision clearly enough that they arrived at the same place reliably and quickly. They argued twice, both times about the kitchen, and both times resolved it by a method that they developed more or less by accident and thereafter employed deliberately, which was to go outside and walk along the creek until they had talked it through to the natural conclusion, which generally turned out to be somewhere in the vicinity of the middle. They were happy. It was not a dramatic happiness. It was not the happiness of songs or of the kind of novels that arrived in Caldwell's general store by mail order and were passed between the women of the ladies' society until they fell apart at the spine. It was a practical, daily, rooted happiness, the happiness of people who have chosen each other with clear eyes and find, every day, that the choice holds up. They made each other laugh. They made each other think. They argued and resolved and learned and grew, and at the end of the day they found each other in the same house, and the specific gravity of that was sufficient. By April of 1879, Esther told him she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen without ceremony, very directly, because she was Esther and that was how she did things. He set down what he was holding, a coffee cup, and he looked at her, and then he crossed the kitchen and held her face in his hands in the way he had at the altar by the creek, and he looked at her, and what was in his expression was something she had no word for in any language, which was appropriate, because some things need to exist beyond the edge of language. "A baby," he said. "A baby," she confirmed. He kissed her, and then he stepped back and picked up his coffee cup and stood looking at the wall for a moment as though locating himself, and she watched him with great fondness. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I am," he said, "more than all right. I'm trying to hold it. It wants to be too large." "Let it be large," she said. "It's a large thing." He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "it is." Thomas Quinn, when he was told, stood up very carefully on his bad back and shook Ira's hand for a long time. Margaret Quinn, when she was told, sat down abruptly in the kitchen chair and covered her mouth with her apron and made a sound that was absolutely unintelligible but perfectly clear. Thomas's back was getting worse by that spring, and the farm was a concern. Esther and Ira had thought about this and talked about it with the same practicality they brought to the kitchen renovation and the cattle market, and what they arrived at was an arrangement whereby Ira took on the management of the Quinn farm alongside his own land, which was more work than one man should probably attempt, but which Ira approached with the methodical determination that was his characteristic mode of operation, and which they supplemented by hiring a hand named Caleb, a young man of 22 from one of the cattle trail families who had decided he wanted to be a farmer rather than a trail hand, and who turned out to be worth twice what they were paying him because he had an instinct for land and animals and work that some people are simply born with. The summer of 1879 was better than the summer of 1878. The rains came when they were needed, and the cattle price held, and the kitchen at the Hartwell place, their place, Esther had started calling it the Malone place in her head and now sometimes out loud, was finished to something that was genuinely beautiful, with the light coming in the east window in the morning, and the good smell of whatever was on the stove, and the table where they ate with the scratched surface that was beginning to acquire the particular patina of daily use. The baby came in October, on a Tuesday, preceded by 14 hours of labor that Esther endured with characteristic stubbornness and no drama, with Margaret Quinn and the midwife attending and Ira sitting on the porch in the cold night doing nothing of any use and doing it with great intensity. When Margaret came out to tell him it was done and to come in, he stood up so fast he knocked over the chair behind him and did not notice. The baby was a boy. He was red and considerably annoyed and had a tuft of dark hair and enormous dark eyes. Ira's eyes, Margaret said, but Esther thought they were something entirely their own, and Ira held him with the careful, stunned hands of a man who has never held something so small and so completely real, and he looked at Esther over the baby's head, and Esther was exhausted and triumphant and more beautiful than he had words for. They named him Thomas James Malone, for Esther's father and for Ira's older brother who had died of fever in Missouri in 1872, and Thomas Quinn, when he held his namesake granddaughter for the first time, his namesake grandson became so composed in his face that it was clear he was only barely managing to remain so. The boy, Tom, as he was immediately and permanently called, turned out to be a healthy and vigorous child who walked at 10 months and was running at 11, to the collective alarm of everyone, and who had his mother's tendency to look at you directly when he had something to say, which, given that he had not yet developed words, expressed itself as a kind of intense, communicative staring that his grandfather found both hilarious and extremely familiar. Life was good. Life moved. In the spring of 1881, Esther told Ira she was expecting again. This time she told him on the porch in the evening, while Tom was asleep inside, and Ira received this news with less stunned silence and more open joy, which she appreciated. This baby came in November, a girl, smaller than Tom had been, with a cap of auburn hair that everyone exclaimed over and blue eyes that were going to be, Esther thought, almost exactly the color of creek water where it runs deep and clear. They named her Clara Rose, and she was a different kind of person from her brother from the very beginning, quieter and more watchful, with a serenity of temperament that seemed improbable in an infant but was already evident, a stillness that she had not gotten from either of her parents and which seemed to be entirely her own. Tom received Clara with the complicated benevolence of a 2-year-old who has decided to tolerate a development he did not specifically request, which gradually, over the course of the first few months, transformed into a fierce and somewhat overwhelming protectiveness that Clara bore with equanimity. Caldwell changed around them, the way frontier towns change, the cattle trail shifting, new people arriving, old businesses closing and new ones opening, the town getting bigger and also in some ways smaller, as the open land at its edges filled in, and the particular quality of the frontier gave way by degrees to something more settled and permanent. The cattle drives that had made Caldwell what it was were beginning to trail off by the early 1880s, as the railroads reached further south and the need for the long drives diminished, and the town had to decide what it was going to be next. Esther had thoughts about this. She had thoughts about most things, and she had spent enough time watching the town's economy and the land around it to have developed a perspective on what Caldwell's future might look like if it chose well. And she wrote these thoughts up, not as a formal document which would have been dismissed, but as a practical letter, and she gave them to Ira, who read them carefully and said, "This is good. Calloway's on the town committee. Can I share this with him?" She looked at him. "You don't need to ask my permission to share my ideas." "I know," he said. "I'm asking because I wanted you to know what I was doing with them." She gave him the letter. Calloway read it and brought it to the committee and attributed it, accurately, to Esther Malone, which caused some raised eyebrows among committee members who had fixed views about the appropriate domains of women's thinking, and also some genuine interest among the members who were more concerned with the quality of the thinking than its provenance. Several of her suggestions were adopted, and one of them, regarding the development of a feed and grain cooperative that would stabilize prices for the farming families around Caldwell, eventually became one of the important economic anchors of the town's transition away from the cattle era. Esther was not on the committee. She was not invited to be on the committee. This was an injustice of the particular quiet kind that did not announce itself dramatically but accumulated, the way small stones pile to become something you cannot step over, and she was clear-eyed about it without allowing it to make her bitter, which was perhaps the most difficult thing she did. She did what she could do, in the ways it was available to her to do it, and she trusted that the work itself had value regardless of whether it was credited to her, and she taught her daughter, when Clara was old enough to understand, both the injustice and the response to it, that the work was worth doing, that you did not wait for permission to be useful, and that the day would come when the permission would not be required. Tom was 5 when Esther and Ira had a conversation that had been building for some time, the way important conversations build, not arriving suddenly, but accumulating significance until they had to be had. It was about the land, specifically about the original Quinn farm, which Thomas Quinn could not work in any real capacity anymore. His back had made the decision for him by 1882, reducing him to a supervisory role that was not sufficient for the land's needs. The farm needed to be either sold or absorbed into what Ira and Esther were running, and Thomas, after a long period of not wanting to discuss it, arrived at the conclusion that absorption was the right answer, and he asked Ira directly if he was willing to take it on. Ira said yes without hesitation, but he said also that he wanted the deed to go to Esther, not to him, that the Quinn farm was Esther's legacy, and he wanted that to be formal and clear, which was not something Thomas had expected him to say, and which resulted in another handshake of considerable duration. They moved Thomas and Margaret into the Malone farmhouse, where there was room, and where Thomas could sit on the porch and watch the land he had worked for 20 years being worked by his son-in-law and his grandson and the young hand Caleb, and Margaret could be in the kitchen she preferred and near her grandchildren, which was what she had wanted without saying so. Thomas Quinn died in the winter of 1884, on a Tuesday in February, peacefully, in the room they had made for him in the farmhouse, with Esther and Margaret and Ira beside him and Clara asleep in the next room, and Tom sitting very still in the hallway because he was 7 years old and understood that something large and important was happening. He had been failing slowly through the fall, and the decline had been its own kind of grace, offering time for what needed to be said, and Thomas Quinn had used that time with the deliberate purpose that had characterized everything he did, telling each of them what he needed them to know, and leaving nothing unfinished that he could help. Esther held her father's hand at the end and thought about the porch where she had grown up in the creek bend in May when the columbines came in, and she thought about the morning she had picked the flowers for her first wedding and had let herself feel hopeful in the wet grass, and she thought that the thing she had been hopeful about had come to her, only later, and in a better form than she had imagined, and she thought her father had known this or suspected it even when it had seemed unlikely, because he was a man who trusted land and the slow work of time, and she was grateful for that trust and for the model of it. They buried him in the Caldwell cemetery on a cold, clear day with the whole of the town's better part in attendance, because Thomas Quinn had been the kind of man who was not celebrated in his lifetime, and then missed with a completeness that made people realize, too late, that they should have said so sooner. The Reverend gave a eulogy that was honest and sufficient. Ira stood with his arm around Esther's shoulders, and she allowed herself to lean into him, which she did not always allow, and he was steady and warm and present, which she had come to understand was the thing he most reliably was. Margaret Quinn lived with them through the years that followed, and she was a presence in the farmhouse of extraordinary value, the kind of grandmother who made a household richer in ways that could not be itemized. She taught Clara to make the blackberry preserves and taught Tom to read, though he had already begun to learn at the school, because she believed that reading required multiple instructors to be done properly. She sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the land and seemed to find in it a sufficiency that Esther envied sometimes, that quality of being made content by the present moment, by the specific view in front of you. Tom grew up to be a tall boy with his grandfather's steadiness and his mother's directness and Ira's quality of patience, which was a combination that made him easy to be around and difficult to argue with. He loved the land in the particular way that people who have grown up working it do, not romantically but practically, with the knowledge of what it required and what it gave back, and the willingness to meet it on its own terms. By 14, he was working alongside Ira and Caleb as a full hand, not as a concession to his age, but because he was genuinely useful and knew it without it making him arrogant. Clara was a different creature, interior and observant, with the habit of watching everything before she moved, and the kind of precision in her actions that suggested she had thought through what she was going to do before she did it. She read everything she could get her hands on, which in Caldwell by the mid-1880s was becoming a more feasible aspiration as the town grew and things like a lending library began to be discussed, and then established. She had her father's eyes and her mother's chin, and a quality entirely her own that was quiet and particular and impossible to overlook, which made people who expected a quiet girl to be a simple one regularly surprised. By 1885, Esther and Ira had been married for 7 years, and their world had been built stone by stone and day by day into something solid and particular and full. The Malone farm was the most productive operation within 3 miles of Caldwell, not because they had been lucky, but because they had been careful and consistent, and because they made good decisions together. Esther's understanding of markets and patterns and Ira's understanding of land and animals and practical management working together in a way that was not always smooth. They still argued, still went to the creek to walk it out. But that reliably arrived somewhere better than either of them would have gotten alone. The morning of a September day in 1885, Esther came out to the porch with her coffee and stood watching the light come up over the eastern fields, the way it did in September when it had that particular quality, that clear and measured light that made everything look like it had been washed clean. And she thought about standing on the steps of First Methodist 7 years earlier in her wedding dress with the doors open before her and the whole of Caldwell staring at her back. And she thought about the man's voice from the back of the room, quiet and weighted and perfectly certain. That is not how this ends. She heard Ira behind her before she heard him, the way she always heard him, a kind of intuition she had developed that was not mystical but simply attentiveness, the specific sound of his boots and the weight of his step. And then he was beside her, his own coffee in his hand, his shoulder against hers, watching the light come up over the fields that were theirs. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The church," she said. "The morning." He was quiet for a moment. He knew which morning. "Do you regret any of it?" she asked. "None," he said without hesitation. "Even the parts that were hard, especially the parts that were hard," he said. "Those are the parts that showed us what we were." She leaned into his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they stood looking at the September light on the eastern fields. And inside the house they could hear Tom's footsteps, early riser that he had always been, moving through the kitchen toward the door. And somewhere above the east field a lark was working through its particular morning announcement. And the creek was making the sound the creek always made, that constant and patient sound. And the sky was the particular blue of September that had no equivalent in any other season. "Ira," she said. "I'm going to have another baby," she said. He turned and looked at her. "I know," she said to the expression. "We are not young exactly." "We're not old," he said immediately, and then, how are you?" "I am very well," she said. "I've been thinking about it for a few weeks." He pulled her closer and kissed her hair, and she felt his chest expand and release under the arm she had put around him. "A baby," he said. "The third one," she said. "We are apparently committed to this." He laughed, and the laugh was warm and real and completely unself-conscious, the laugh of a man who is in his life rather than performing it. "Yes," he said. "Apparently we are." Tom appeared at the door behind them and took in the scene, his parents standing on the porch in the early morning, his father's arm around his mother's shoulders, both of them looking out at the fields, and he said, with the practicality of a boy who had grown up watching adults being people, "Is something happening?" "Yes," Ira said. "Come out here." Tom came out and stood beside them, and Esther said simply, "You're going to have a new brother or sister." Tom considered this for a moment with the gravity appropriate to significant information, and then he said, "Clara is going to be very interested in this." "She is," Esther agreed. Clara was, in fact, extremely interested, arriving at the news with the analytical attention she brought to everything and immediately beginning to ask practical questions about timeline and logistics, and what arrangements would need to be made, which made Ira and Esther exchange a look of warm amusement over her head that was the particular look they had developed for the moments when their children were most completely themselves. The third baby came in the spring of 1886, in April, when the creek was running high from the snowmelt and the columbines were beginning to come in along the bank. It was a boy, healthy and considerable, with auburn hair like Clara's that everyone suspected would darken an Ira's broad forehead and Esther's eyes, deep and clear and complicated. They named him Samuel, which was Ira's father's name, a man who had worked Missouri soil until it gave out under him, and who had done so with a dignity that Ira had never forgotten and had spent his adult life trying to honor. Samuel Thomas Malone, the Thomas for the grandfather he had not got to know in any conscious way but whose name he would carry, and whose land was part of the land that Samuel would one day stand on. Margaret Quinn held the baby on the afternoon after he was born and looked at him for a long time and then looked up at Esther and said, "Your father would have loved this very much." "I know," Esther said. "He would have made some comment about the hair," Margaret said. "He always said the Quinns ran to red heads when they were in a good mood." "That tracks," Esther said, and Margaret laughed and the baby slept through it. Tom was 12 and Clara was 8 when Samuel came, and the dynamic of the household shifted into something new and full. The way households shift when the composition changes, finding a new equilibrium that contains everyone. Tom was stoic about the baby in public and openly adoring of him in private, holding him in the evenings with a careful competence that suggested he had been paying more attention to how this worked than anyone had realized. Clara was methodical and affectionate, and remarkably good at interpreting what Samuel wanted at a time before he could say, which Margaret said was a gift that some people had and others didn't, and Clara had it completely. The years did what years do. Caleb, the hand they had hired, turned out to be a permanent fixture. He had become something more than an employee and something less formal than family, one of those people who exists at the productive intersection of both, and he eventually bought a small piece of the property adjacent to theirs and built a house there, and married a woman from Wichita named Rose who had come out to take the teaching position Miss Hartley vacated. When Miss Hartley finally accepted the proposal of a widower from Abilene in 1887, and Rose and Esther became the kind of friends that people become when they find each other useful in all the ways that matter and entertaining in the rest. Dewey from the livery stable got married too, to a widow named Helen who had 3 children and a practical manner, and who managed Dewey with an ease that suggested she had been specifically constructed for the purpose. And they had 2 more children together, and the Malone farm and the Dewey household developed a relationship of mutual hospitality that meant the children grew up in and out of each other's lives in the comfortable way of people whose parents have decided they like each other. Tom at 17 was already the kind of young man who made you want to revise upward your expectations of what young men could be, with a seriousness of purpose that was not joyless but grounded, a sense of what he was working toward and why it mattered. Ira watched his son with the particular attention of a father who is trying not to be astonished by the person his child has become, because the astonishment feels private, and he said to Esther one evening quietly, "I did not know it would be like this." "Like what?" she asked. "Like watching the thing you built turn out better than you imagined the plans," he said. "The children are better than what we put into them." "That is not how it works," she said with some amusement. "They come with their own materials." "Doesn't matter," he said. "I still didn't know it would feel like this." She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, the way he had first taken her hand on the porch of her parents' farm, in the July evening a lifetime ago. And he looked at her, and she looked back, and something moved between them that was not simple and not reducible, and was completely familiar. The specific warmth of 2 people who have been through enough together that they do not have to perform anything for each other, who can be exactly what they are in the same space without it costing anything. "I love you," she said. "I know," he said. "I love you too." "You could have said that first," she pointed out. "I know," he agreed. "But you said it and I meant it, and that seemed sufficient." Clara, at 15, had begun to write. Not letters or diary entries, but actual writing, essays and stories and observations about the world around her, that had a quality of intelligence and precision that made Esther and Ira read them, and look at each other with the particular expression of parents who have encountered something that is already beyond what they can adequately assess. Rose, who was the school teacher, had a more technical framework for what she was reading, and she told Esther one afternoon while they were putting up preserves in the Malone kitchen that Clara had a mind she had not encountered before in a student in her career, which was not said competitively, but honestly, with the pleasure that good teachers take in encountering genuinely exceptional material. Clara would not, they understood, stay in Caldwell forever. This was not a loss, or it was a loss, but the right kind, the kind that is the cost of raising someone who has enough room to become who they are. There were teachers' colleges now, and institutions in Kansas City and further east that were, by the later 1880s, accepting women, and Clara was going to find her way to one of them. And that was the right outcome, and both Esther and Ira knew it, and held it separately in their hearts, and did not speak of it often because it did not need to be addressed until it was time. Samuel grew up in the way that third children grow up, with the particular advantages of being loved by two older siblings who had already figured out a great deal, and the particular advantages of parents who were, by his arrival, more settled in themselves and in each other and in the life they had built, and who had a quality of presence that earlier in their marriage they had been working harder to maintain. He was a joyful child, with a quality of enthusiasm that was catching, and he had Ira's patience in the exact same configuration as Esther's directness, which was an unusual combination that meant he was someone who thought carefully and then said exactly what he meant, and who encountered the world with a fundamental expectation that it was going to be interesting. The Columbines came back every year along the creek bank. Esther noticed them every May, the way the May light hit them when the morning was still cool and the creek was running clear, and she thought about the woman who had picked them in a white dress before the day that had turned her life around, and she thought about that woman with something that was not quite pity and not quite recognition, but a kind of tenderness, the way you feel for someone you once were who did not yet know what was coming. It was the late spring of 1891 when Esther was in the kitchen with Margaret, who was 70 now and still sharp and still present and still in possession of opinions on every relevant topic. And Ira came in from the fields with the kind of expression that meant he had been thinking about something all morning. He poured himself water and drank it, and then he set the cup down and said, "I want to do something." Both women looked at him. "I want to take you somewhere," he said to Esther. "Where?" she asked. "Nowhere far," he said. "Just come with me." She looked at Margaret, who made a small gesture with her head that meant go, and she wiped her hands on her apron and went with him. He had saddled the horses while she was getting her hat, 2 good horses from the stock they kept, and they rode east along the creek in the spring morning, not fast, just moving, and the land was green and the sky was open, and they rode in the comfortable silence of people who have ridden together enough that the silence is its own kind of conversation. He stopped where the creek bent south, in the cottonwood shade, where the columbines came in thickest. She could see them from the saddle, the blue and gold of them, impossible and alive. "This is where you picked them," he said. "For the first one, the flowers." She looked at him. "You know that. You told me once," he said. "A long time ago. You said you got up before sunrise and came down here and picked them and thought about it being the last morning of your old life." She held this for a moment. "You remembered that." "I remember most things you've told me," he said simply. She looked out at the columbines. The creek was making its patient sound over the smooth stones. The cottonwoods were in full leaf. A redbird called once from somewhere in the branches. "I want to tell you something," he said. She looked at him. "I have thought about that morning every year when the flowers come in," he said. "I have thought about you standing in the wet grass in your everyday dress, letting yourself feel hopeful for a life that was going to disappoint you. And I have thought every year that I want to spend the rest of whatever time I have making it so you don't ever have to brace yourself like that again, that you can feel hopeful and be right about it." She was quiet. "I know we're past the dramatic declarations," he said. "I know that's not where we are, but I wanted to say it out loud. That this, what we have, it was the right thing, and that you were brave walking out of that church, and that I was glad I was there." She looked at him in the May morning, this man she had loved for 13 years, who had sat beside her on a porch while she was angry and had not tried to fix it, who had asked her permission before sharing her ideas, and had held the deed to her land in her name, who had held their children with stunned and careful hands, and grown into fatherhood the way he had grown into everything, with steadiness and good faith, who had walked through difficulty and seasons and loss without losing himself or her, who was sitting on his horse in the creek shadow with the same eyes she had looked at across a church and found immediately complicated. "Ira Malone," she said. "Yes." "When you said that in the church," she said, "that is not how this ends. Did you know what you were doing?" He considered this honestly. I knew that I could not sit there and watch something wrong happen and say nothing. I did not know what would come of saying it. But you said it anyway. Yes. Because it was true, she said. Because it was true. She nodded slowly and looked out at the columbines again. I pick them every year, she said. I put them in a jar on the kitchen table. You've never asked why. I know why, he said. Do you? Because they're what you had in your hands the day your life changed, he said. Not the first day, the second day, the day you chose. She looked at him and felt something that was not sentimentality. She was not a sentimental woman. She had never been, but was something durable and true, the specific emotion of a person who has lived fully enough to understand what was almost missed and what was not. Come here, she said. He rode closer and she leaned across the space between the horses and kissed him. There in the cottonwood shade by the creek where the columbines grew. And the horses were patient, and the morning was warm, and the creek kept making its sound. That endless and unhurried sound, as though time were not running but simply flowing. The way water flows, always moving and always in the same place. Always the same river and always new. They rode home through the spring morning, not hurrying, side by side, and the Malone farm came into view as they crested the low rise above the creek. The house with its good bones repaired, and its new kitchen and its porch where they had spent so many evenings, and the fields in their spring green, and the Quinn land adjoining, and the whole of what they had built together visible from here, particular and solid and alive. The kind of thing that continues after the people who built it are gone, because it was built for more than one generation. Margaret was on the porch when they came back, and Tom was coming in from the east field, and Clara had a book open in the shade of the oak tree, and Samuel was chasing something across the yard with the joyful impracticality of an 8-year-old who has not yet been told to stop, and the whole of it was exactly what it was, not perfect, not without its weight, not untouched by the difficulty that every life accumulates, but good. Genuinely, substantially, irreducibly good. Esther dismounted and gave her horse to Tom, who took the reins with the easy competence of 17 years on this land, and she walked up the path to the porch and sat down beside her mother, and Margaret poured her coffee without being asked, and they sat in the spring morning the way they had been sitting together for years, easy and familiar, while the land did what land does and the children moved across it, and Ira came up the path behind her and took the porch step and sat on it, leaning against the post, his hat on his knee, looking out at the fields. And Samuel came running up breathless with something in his cupped hands, some small creature he had found in the yard, and he held it out to show them with the pure and absolute certainty of a child who knows his family will look, and they all leaned in to see. And the creature, a small toad, blinking in the light of being suddenly held, regarded them all from Samuel's palms with an expression of enormous dignity, and everyone laughed. The sound of it went out across the farm, that laughing, over the fields and down to the creek and up into the blue spring sky, and the toad blinked, and the columbines bloomed along the water, and the Malone land lay green and warm and full in the May of 1891, and everything that had needed to happen had happened, and everything that needed to stay had stayed. And the ending was not an ending at all, but only the word for the place where the story becomes too large and too ongoing to be contained in any particular account of it, and simply continues.